So Arlecchino has finally arrived, and after playing with her for a while, I gotta say, this showcase video is going to be full of twists because I've tested her with 5 different weapons and the results shocked me. But what surprised me even more was the way you need to play with her in order to maximize her damage, because let's face it, we have plenty of pyro damage dealers like Hu Tao. So what does Arlecchino offer that others cannot do? Well, that's what we're gonna find out today, so you can see for yourself just how good is Constellation Zero Arlecchino. But first, thanks to Zen Market for sponsoring today's video. Look, I love me some good merch, but sometimes the stuff I want to get is in Japan where it won't ship to me. And so this is where Zen Market comes in, who offers excellent Japan shopping proxy service. On Zen Market, you can buy from over 10,000 Japanese stores, including Amazon, Rakuten, and Mercari, but you can also just easily post the item link from almost any Japanese store into Zen Market's search bar, and you can buy it through them. For example, I've just ordered this official statue of Her Excellency, and I'm hoping this will finally make Kujo-Sara notice me. And how it basically works is that when Zen Market shops on behalf of you, they will store your items for up to 60 days. So you can consolidate multiple purchases before shipping them off to yourself, and if you're unsure about something, the website supports 19 languages and is trusted by 2 million users worldwide. What's even better, when you register an account on Zen Market and use my code GACHAGAMER, you will receive 1000 Zen points, which is equivalent to 1000 yen you can use for international shipping. So make sure to use my link in the description to place your first order in Zen Market, use my promo code shown here, and buy some amazing merch from Japan. So Arlecchino, also known as Father or Daddy, is the new 5-star Pyro Polearm unit, who specializes in dealing big on-field damage, as long as you can manage her Bond of Life correctly. There's a lot of things I want to cover today about her, because while in reality you can just spam her normal attacks to see those funny numbers pop up quickly, there is a certain mindset you first need to adapt. So let's first take a look at her personal damage potential. For now, she will be equipped with White Tassel, a 3-star weapon, but later on it will also be compared to Missive Wind Spear, Deathmatch, Ballad of the Fjords, and her signature weapon, while her main artifact set for this showcase is going to be the new Fragment of Harmonic Whimsy 4 set. But Gladiator set also works absolutely fine, and it's not that far behind in terms of her best DPS potential. And when it comes to her talents, they are all raised to level 10, and of course, she's Constellation Zero. Now, going straight into her personal potential with buffs, in a vaporized team comp, she can unleash some big damage with her normal attacks by just spamming them on the poor Asimov here. Each hit ranges between 40 to 50,000 damage, while at the same time, she can vape from 89,000 all the way to almost 120k damage. And to me, that's a pretty insane output, considering she's only using White Tassel. And in total, by just taking up 7 seconds of field time, she dishes out nearly 660,000 damage, which is pretty huge. But the first interesting thing that I've noticed, when compared to someone like Hu Tao, was that her vapes only make up 36% of total damage, while the rest of the damage is coming from non-vape attacks. What this means is that not only she will work great in vaporized comps, but also in other teams such as Mono Pyro and Overload, because as we can see from this finding, her raw damage is really big. But let's take a step back, and let me explain how she can actually deal this amount of damage. So normally, just like any melee user, Daddy likes to deal white physical damage. But to make those numbers go from white to orange, she needs to obtain Bond of Life. And initially, I wrote like 3 pages how this Bond of Life works, but then I realized we're just here to watch a showcase. So all this info will be provided in her guide video I'll release soon. And instead, here's a very basic explanation. Okay, so she needs to use her skill. It deals below average damage, like 11,465 here, and provides 5 energy particles, which is nice. More importantly, it will mark enemies with Blood Depth Directive, which is this debuff that appears. When the enemies have this mark, you want to use Arlecchino's charge attack to absorb those marks and gain Bond of Life, which will then in return provide Pyro Infusion and drastically improve her normal attack damage. However, each time her normal attacks hit the enemy, you can see Bond of Life is getting reduced here, and on top of that, her damage also starts to decrease because the more Bond of Life she has, the better the boost it provides to normal attack damage. So in other words, Father starts off with really strong damage, but it gradually decreases with every attack. Also, if you look at the skill's cooldown, it's really long, but with each powered up normal attack, you can decrease it by 0.8 seconds. So usually, by the time you're done with her combos, you can use the skill immediately again. Now, what you actually want to do is utilize the first passive talent, because it states that if the Blood Depth Directive remains on the enemies for at least 5 seconds, it will visually change like you can see here, and then when Arlecchino absorbs it, it will provide a lot more Bond of Life. So in a nutshell, for best damage potential, you want to use Arlecchino's skill and apply the marks, then switch out to other teammates, do some buffing or some other stuff, and then come back to finally absorb the marks and then deal the best possible damage. For example, with the previous setup I've shown while using White Tassel, Arlecchino gains 130% Bond of Life, which means she can unleash a total of 19 normal attacks before she loses the buffing that's coming from Bond of Life. However, as you can see here, she still has some of it left over, but now she's dealing white damage. Well, that's because 30% Bond of Life still needs to exceed her max HP in order for her to gain that sweet power up. Now, there's another crucial and unique thing you need to keep in mind about Daddy-O. So, because of her third passive, while in combat, she cannot be healed by anyone, but in exchange, she gains 40% pyro damage bonus, which is pretty huge. Still, the big question is, how to keep her alive then? Well, that's where the burst comes in. It will deal this cool AoE damage. It's not much, around 32,000 unbuffed damage, but on the flip side, any Bond of Life Arlecchino has will be removed and converted to a big heal, which also gets partially boosted by her attack. Basically, treat her burst as emergency healing, since it sadly resets her Bond of Life, and you definitely want to have as much of it as possible. Although on the other hand, the burst also resets the skill's cooldown. Now, normally, if you play her with a shielder, the burst won't be needed much for healing. However, if she's not shielded, boy, it can be rough sometimes, since I don't believe she has any resistance to interruption unless you activate her first constellation. So she can easily get knocked around by enemies, but if you do dash with her, this also means losing precious time that you could otherwise utilize to deal better damage while all the buffs are active from other teammates. Still, there is a small silver lining, and that has to do with her second passive, which provides all type resistance for each 100 attacks she has above 1000. So for example, if she has 1872 attack from the stats shown here, we can see she gains 8.7% resistance for everything, which can help a lot by taking less damage if she's not shielded. But overall, Arlecchino works like a well-oiled machine. Her main fuel is the skill that marks the enemies, so she can absorb those marks to gain Bond of Life, which in return provides powerful damage boost and fire infusion. However, with each normal attack that hits, she also loses Bond of Life, and the lower her Bond of Life is, the less damage she deals. Finally, her burst is there to provide emergency healing, but if you can avoid using it, her Bond of Life with each new rotation will be slightly higher, because some of it will always remain when doing the whole combo over again. So don't be surprised when you see a bunch of thumbnails from content creators showing off that first big huge hit Arlecchino can unleash, where you can fully utilize that maximum 200% Bond of Life. But yeah, with this out of the way, let's talk about her weapons and how good she is compared to other pyro damage dealers. Okay, so here's the plan. White Tassel's baseline damage has already been established. It's a really good and cheap free-to-play option, so I wanted to compare it to a few other weapons. Keep in mind, this is just some real-time data I've obtained, and the results will vary a lot if using different teams and even builds. So for this showcase, I am comparing the weapons in a vaporized team with Zhongli, Benny, and Yelan. Now, starting off with Deathmatch, it immediately has a strong advantage because I am testing this against a single enemy, which is this boss, Asimov. So that means it gains 48% attack boost from the passive at refinement level 5, and on average, the damage compared to White Tassel was about 7% better, which is pretty decent. But what's important here to understand is that both White Tassel and Deathmatch are low base attack weapons, so they perform best with Bennett, since he can provide a huge attack boost by himself to help compensate the lack of attack that Arlecchino would have otherwise. Still, moving over, Missive Windspear ends up almost evenly matched with White Tassel. However, keep in mind without Bennett, this would be a different story. And on top of that, we can see that the first attack Missive Windspear deals is lower than White Tassel's. Well, that's because you first need to trigger a reaction for this weapon to gain its passive, and it's pretty huge because it starts catching up then. Now, on the other hand, my Ballad of the Fjords is only refined to level 2, so while it deals about 1% more damage than White Tassel, I imagine it could be better if there was no Benin team, or if the Vaporized team was changed up, and of course, if the weapon was refined to max level 5. However, the biggest winner, of course, is going to be the signature weapon, Crimson Moon's Semblance. On average, it provided a massive 25 to 35% better damage increase compared to White Tassel. Now, I know the gap is huge here, but we're talking about a premium weapon compared to something you can obtain for free, and it's a 3-star weapon that can go head-to-head with several 4-star weapons pretty well. If you think this is a flawed way to test, let me know. I just wanted to see some field data and check out how the weapons feel. Seriously, don't use these calculations as gospel because there's a ton of variables when it comes to testing weapons. And honestly, overall, I would say that she performs really well with a lot of polearms. I haven't tested some good stat sticks like Jade Spear, Calamity Queller, Homa, and Staff of Scarlet Sands, but at least in my initial calcs, they all seem to be good options that I will explain later in my upcoming guide video. But the point of this comparison was to highlight the viability of White Tassel, since it's a super cheap 3-star weapon that's easy to obtain, and if you don't have it, Missive Wind Spear also works great. Still, let's talk about Arlecchino as Pyro DPS. We have plenty of them, right? So why bother getting her? Well, to be frank, at this point, I would say that it's a matter of whom you prefer to use, although I do believe that her damage so far is really good. For example, if we take the good old benchmark that is Hu Tao, what is the difference between them? Well, Hu Tao's playstyle revolves around managing her HP and doing proper cancelling with her charge attacks. On the other hand, you also want to manage Bond of Life on Arlecchino, although I would say it's a bit easier since you just spam normal attacks without needing to do any special techs, at least not that I've found any so far. And you can repeat the combo over and over again by just reapplying the blood depth marks. Both of them also kinda depend on shielding, although at this point, I would say Arlecchino definitely relies on shielding a bit more, since she cannot be healed by anyone, whereas Hu Tao can at least gain some HP from things like Xingqiu's Hydro Swords. I think that the most important thing right now is to admit that Arlecchino's damage is very formidable even in the early days, and it can be unleashed pretty easily, especially with the right teammates. So let's talk about this now. So far, I've been showcasing Arlecchino in vaporized teams, but what about other comps? Well, if we look at something like Mono Pyro, she feels great, and since I've already mentioned this, her raw damage, even without relying on vaporized reactions, is quite big. And you can clearly see here the amount of damage she can dish out in this Kazuha, Benny, and Xiangling team. Now, the big problem here is the lack of shielding, although if you go up against multiple enemies, usually Kazuha can still stagger them, which can then be useful. But one other thing that I really like about this team is that Arlecchino's skill provides 5 pyro particles, which can help reduce Xiangling's energy requirements, and you can even funnel those particles to her when setting up the blood depth marks. Still, in this comp, I found myself using Arlecchino's burst often, compared to a team with a shielder. However, nobody said you couldn't use Archaic Petra Zhongli instead of Kazuha here, to get the shielding if you need it. Now, there's also Overload team with Chevy. Unfortunately, I don't have a C6 Chevres. In fact, she's C0, so the team's potential definitely takes a slight nosedive compared to other comps. However, it still feels really good, especially if this team does not include Bennett, because the thing about his circle is that it often feels really restrictive, considering Arlecchino needs to stay inside it to deal great damage. Obviously, if you go with a Chevres Overload team without Bennett, be prepared to accept the fact White Tassel won't perform well in this team, and you're better off using another weapon with higher base attack, like a 5-star stat stick, or I don't know, something like Blacklift Pole. But overall, from my estimation so far, C6 Chevy with Bennett is the best version of Overload, while the last slot could be either Fischl, Yaimiko, or Beto, if you can somehow manage to get a lot of energy recharge with a couple of Favoni's weapons, because Beto's burst does provide some shielding at C1 and resistance to interruption as well as damage reduction. But going back to good old vape teams, a lot of them work super well. To name a few, VV Shred teams are a bit hard to execute, but yield a big damage potential, like this one here with Kazuha, Benny, and Xingqiu, or you could easily go with Double Hydro Bennett, although keep in mind both these teams lack shielding, so you'll need to play around that. However, the most comfortable option that I've found so far is Arlecchino, Bennett, a Shielder, and Hydro Applicator. For example, a team of Benny, Zhongli, and Yalan is super easy to play. Yalan with no problems can maintain Hydro Aura on enemies, so Father can vape her normal attacks with ease. All in all, the 4th Harbinger feels great and plays great. The best things to highlight would be that you don't need to rely on her burst, which means I barely have to think about energy recharge when I'm building her. And on top of that, she also provides 5 pyro particles that can be either caught by her or funneled to somebody else who needs energy. On top of that, her playstyle is pretty easy. Just apply some marks, switch out, set up the rest of the rotation, and come back to wreak some havoc with big damage, especially if you're vaping it. Now, on the other hand, I do feel a lot worse when I need to play her without a shielder. The fact that nobody can heal her besides the burst can be annoying sometimes, especially considering that she also loses any bond of life she had when the burst is used, resulting in weaker rotations going forward. And of course, Hoyo just had to put that first constellation as a bait, since it provides resistance to interruption when her normal attacks are powered up. Although I would say getting interrupted is just one part of the problem, since you also need to keep her alive, which is why I usually trigger the burst. But overall, I would say that she has exceeded my expectations, at least right now. It's possible that when playing with a new character, I'm going to make some technical mistakes, and once I get used to it, it will be easier to evaluate her potential compared to other Pyro DPS units. But at the end of the day, at least right now, she definitely can deliver really good damage at Constellation 0. Anyway, thanks for watching this video, hope you found it useful, and I would really appreciate it if you could press the subscribe button and hit that like button on this video. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you very soon.